Hi, this is B.V. Ramana, teacher in English. B.V. Ramana English Grammar welcomes you. Now the topic is making non-defining relative clauses. Now let us see the meaning of non-defining relative clause. What is non-defining relative clause? If a relative clause has a self-explanatory antecedent, the relative clause consent is called non-defining relative clause. Look at the example. I met Ramu, who was a doctor. Here, who was a doctor is a relative clause and the antecedent noun phrase is Ramu. So here Ramu is a self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause who was a doctor is called non-defining relative clause because as Ramu the antecedent is a self-explanatory. Here the relative clause need not define the antecedent Ramu. So this relative clause is called non-defining relative clause. Now you have seen if the antecedents are self-explanatory, then the relative clauses that follow will automatically be non-defining relative clauses. So let us see how to make antecedents self-explanatory. Point number one is by adding the adjectives to antecedents. What adjectives are to be added to the antecedents so that the antecedents will be self-explanatory? They are this, that, my, our, your, their, his, her, these, those. If these adjectives are added to the antecedents, then the antecedents will be self-explanatory. And second point is that if we write the proper nouns as antecedents, then the antecedents will be self-explanatory. Those proper nouns include Ramu, Rani, Mumbai, this Sunday, Ramayanam, etc. And one more point is that if we make use of a main clause, entire main clause as antecedent also, the antecedents will be self-explanatory. And the relative clause that follows will be non-defining relative clause. Well, here are two basic things for making non-defining relative clauses. And first point is that we have to change the antecedents into self-explanatory antecedents. And next one is we have to add commas to relative clauses. Look at the example. Here in this example, the antecedent is not self-explanatory. So the clause, relative clause, that is which my father bought, is not non-defining relative clause. If you want to change this clause into non-defining relative clause, we have to change the antecedent, that means the pen, into self-explanatory antecedent. How can we change it into self-explanatory antecedent? Just add this or that adjectives to the pen. So now this or that pen is the self-explanatory antecedent. So automatically the clause which follows will be non-defining relative clause. So which my father bought will be the non-defining relative clause. A comma is kept before it. And now another question is, the boys who have many storybooks are wise. Here the boys is the antecedent, that is not self-explanatory. So if you want to make the relative clause who have many storybooks into non-defining relative clause, then the antecedent is to be changed into self-explanatory antecedent. So here it is changed like this. These are those are added to the boys. So now these are those boys will be self-explanatory antecedents, and the clause which follows it automatically will be non-defining relative clause. So who have many storybooks here will be non-defining relative clause, and it is kept between commas. And example number 3. Here the antecedent, the man, is not a self-explanatory antecedent. So it should be changed into self-explanatory antecedent like this. Ramu, I mean the man is changed into a proper noun, that is self-explanatory antecedent. Then automatically the relative clause that follows will be non-defining relative clause. That means whom she had taught will be the non-defining relative clause that is kept between commas. And last example is he went to school. Here, school is the antecedent and it is not self-explanatory antecedent. So, which is very large, the relative clause is not non-defining relative clause. So, if you want to make this non-defining, if you want to make this relative clause, that means defining relative clause into non-defining relative clause, we can change the entire clause as antecedent. So here, he went to school will be the antecedent. I mean, here the single word is not antecedent. Here the entire clause will be the antecedent. In such case, the relative clause that follows will be non-defining relative clause. So a comma is kept before it. So here, he went to school will be the entire clause will be the antecedent. In this way, if you want to make a relative clause into non-defining relative clause, then the antecedents consent should be made into self-explanatory antecedents. Right, here are some examples of non-defining relative clauses for practice, beginning with who for persons. Raghuram is an intelligent man. Here, Raghuram is a self-explanatory antecedent. So, the relative clause that begins with who that follows will be non-defining relative clause. Because here, who is a teacher, the non-defining relative clause is not necessary to define Raghuram, which has already been the self-explanatory antecedent. In the second one, these are those people will be self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause beginning with who will be the non-defining relative clause. In the third example, look at this or that boy. This or that boy will be the self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause beginning with who, I mean who is very obedient will be the non-defining relative clause. This is not necessary to define the this or that boy antecedent because it will be a self-explanatory antecedent with the adding of this or that to the boy. And now my son is a self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that is who is standing there will be non-defining relative clause. Here who is standing there is not required to define the antecedent my son. And last one, I talked to Mohan will be the another clause. Here Mohan is the self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that is kept after it, I mean the relative clause that follows will be non-defining relative clause. That is who met me yesterday will be non-defining clause as it is not required to define the self-explanatory antecedent that is Mohan. Here are the examples of non-defining relative clauses for practice, beginning with whom plus subject for persons. Here, in the first example, Raghuram is a self-explanatory antecedent, and whom plus subject, whom I like, will be the non-defining relative clause because it is not necessary to define the self-explanatory antecedent Raghuram. So, it is kept between commas. And in the second example, the self-explanatory antecedent is these are those people. So the relative clause that follows will be non-defining relative clause, that is whom she doesn't like, will be non-defining relative clause. A comma is kept before it. And in the third example, this or that boy will be the self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows whom plus subject, I mean the whom she taught English will be the non-defining relative clause. Here, this relative clause is not at all necessary to define that self-explanatory antecedent, that is this or that boy. So, this non-defining relative clause, for this clause, a comma is kept before it. And in the fourth example, my son is a self-explanatory antecedent. So, the clause that comes after it, I mean the clause that follows it, will be non-defining relative clause. So, whom they are praising will be non-defining relative clause which is kept before which is kept between the commas. So here it is not at all required to define the self-explanatory antecedent, that is my son. And now I talk to Mohan. In this clause, Mohan is the self-explanatory antecedent, and the relative clause that begins with whom plus subject, I mean whom they like very much, will be non-defining relative clause, as Mohan is the self-explanatory antecedent. Here, a comma is kept before this non-defining relative clause. Here are the examples of non-defining relative clauses for practice, beginning with whose plus noun, which is used for expression of possession of persons, things, animals. Raghuram, in the first example, is a self-explanatory antecedent. So, the relative clause beginning with whose pen I took will be the non-defining relative clause, which is kept between commas. And these are those dogs will be the self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows, I mean beginning with whose plus subject noun, whose tails are very short, will be non-defining relative clause which has a comma before it. And in the third example, this or that boy is the self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows, whose bat is here, I mean the relative clause beginning with whose plus noun, whose bat is here, will be non-defining relative clause. Here this relative clause is not at all required to define the this or that boy, which is a self-explanatory antecedent. So a comma is kept before it. And my son is a self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause beginning with whose plus noun, that is whose books are here, will be non-defining relative clause. And in the last example, the Mohan, I talked to Mohan. Mohan is the self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows beginning with whose plus noun, I mean whose help I took yesterday, will be non-defining relative clause, because here it is not required to define Mohan, which is a self-explanatory antecedent. Well, here are the examples of non-defining relative clauses for practice, beginning with which. Here, which is used for things, animals, and places. Look at this first example. Vijayawada is a place. It is self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows, beginning with which, will be non-defining relative clause. So here, which I like will be the non-defining relative clause, which is kept between commas. Here this is non-defining clause because here it is not required to define Vijayawada, which is a self-explanatory antecedent. And second one, these are those places, is also self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause beginning with which to show the places, that is which I bought 5 years ago, will be the non-defining relative clause. And third one, this or that dog is the animal, and this is also self-explanatory antecedent with the existence of the adjectives this or that. So the relative clause beginning with which that follows will be non-defining relative clause. Here which is very faithful will be the non-defining relative clause. It has also a comma before it. And next one, my house is a self-explanatory antecedent because of existence of possessive adjective my. So the relative clause beginning with which that follows will be non-defining relative clause, and which I bought last year will be the non-defining relative clause. And here it is not at all required to define my house, which is a self-explanatory antecedent. And now the last one, this is Ramayanam. Ramayanam is also self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows beginning with which my mother reads every day will be the non-defining relative clause. Well, here are some examples of non-defining relative clauses for practice, beginning with when, where, why, how, for, showing time, places, reason, and manner, respectively. I will meet him this Monday. This Monday is a self-explanatory antecedent because of existence of this. And so the relative clause that beginning with when he comes will be non-defining relative clause. Here when he comes, he is a non-defining relative clause because here it is not required to define the antecedent this Monday, which is a self-explanatory antecedent. And next, Pathpatnam is a place and proper noun. So the relative clause beginning with where, I mean where I live, will be the non-defining relative clause which is kept between commas. And here it is also not required to define Pathpatnam, which is a self-explanatory antecedent. And third one, this or that reason is also self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows why he was absent will be the non-defining relative clause. And last one, this manner will be the self-explanatory antecedent as it has this as an adjective. And so the relative clause that follows will be the non-defining relative clause. I mean how he behaves will be the non-defining relative clause which is kept between commas. Here it is not required to define this manner as it has already been a self-explanatory antecedent. Right, here are examples of non-defining relative clauses for practice beginning with which. Here which is used for entire main clause. He is an intelligent man. This is the main clause, and which I believe is the relative clause. Here this relative clause is called non-defining relative clause. Here which refers to the entire main clause, that is he is an intelligent man as an antecedent. So which I believe will be the non-defining relative clause. It is also called sentential relative clause. And in the next example, I respect my parents, which is true. Here the relative clause which is true will be the non-defining relative clause because here which refers to the main clause I respect my parents as antecedent. I mean the entire main clause will be the antecedent to the question word which. So which is true will be the non-defining relative clause or sentential relative clause. In the third example, yesterday the boy behaved rudely will act as antecedent, and the entire clause will act as antecedent to the question word which. Here which refers to the entire clause which acts as an antecedent. So this clause which annoyed us very much will be the non-defining relative clause. This is also called sentential non-defining relative clause. They work hard will be the main clause, and which my HM always tell will be the relative clause. Here this relative clause is called non-defining relative clause because here which refers to the entire clause they work hard as an antecedent. So this clause which my HM always tell will be the non-defining relative clause or sentential relative clause. Right, here is a textual exercise. Out of these 10 sentences, which sentences will have non-defining relative clauses? We can easily identify with the help of the antecedents. In the third example, Suresh is a proper noun, so it is an antecedent with self-explanatory characteristic. So as the Suresh is the self-explanatory antecedent, the relative clause that follows will be non-defining relative clause. Similarly, in the eighth example, my sister is a self-explanatory antecedent with the existence of the possessive adjective my. So here the relative clause that follows will be non-defining relative clause. In the same way, in the 10th example, the Telugu film industry is the self-explanatory antecedent. So the relative clause that follows will be the non-defining relative clause. Well friends, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel tapping subscribe button on YouTube. Thank you very much for watching. Namaste.